Question 1. Strategic planning requires a robust assessment of potential future challenges. As Chief Risk Officer, you have identified a severe but plausible liquidity stress scenario that, if modeled, would reveal significant vulnerabilities in the firm's ability to meet its obligations under extreme market conditions. The CEO, concerned about the impact on investor confidence and short-term profitability targets, has suggested excluding this specific scenario from the upcoming liquidity stress testing exercise, arguing it is overly pessimistic and not representative of typical operational conditions. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations and professional ethical obligations for a chief risk officer in this situation? Option A. Agree to exclude the severe liquidity stress scenario as requested by the CEO, focusing instead on less severe scenarios that present a more favorable outlook. Option B. Conduct the stress test with all identified scenarios, but only report the results of the less severe scenarios to the board and senior management. Option C. Insist on including the severe liquidity stress scenario in the testing, clearly documenting the rationale and potential implications, and proposing mitigation strategies. Option D. Argue that the severe liquidity stress scenario is too improbable to warrant inclusion in the stress testing, as it deviates from typical operational conditions. Correct answer is C. Insist on including the severe liquidity stress scenario in the testing, clearly documenting the rationale and potential implications, and proposing mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits the immediate financial pressures of a firm against its long-term regulatory obligations and the ethical duty to maintain financial stability for its clients and the market. The Chief Risk Officer, Crow, is faced with a conflict between the desire to present a favorable short-term financial outlook and the imperative to conduct robust, forward-looking risk assessments, particularly concerning liquidity. The regulatory framework for risk management, as exemplified by the principles governing the CRM Principles of Risk Management exam, mandates that firms proactively identify, measure, and manage risks, including liquidity risk, even when such assessments might reveal uncomfortable truths about the firm's resilience. The correct approach involves the CRO insisting on the inclusion of a severe, albeit plausible, liquidity stress scenario in the firm's stress testing program, even if it highlights potential vulnerabilities. This is ethically sound and regulatorily compliant because it aligns with the principle of prudent risk management. Regulatory bodies expect firms to test their resilience against a range of plausible stress events, including those that are severe. The goal of stress testing is not to avoid identifying weaknesses, but to understand them, quantify their potential impact, and develop mitigation strategies. By advocating for the inclusion of this scenario, the CRO upholds their professional responsibility to provide an accurate and comprehensive assessment of the firm's risk profile, thereby enabling informed decision-making and ensuring the firm's long-term viability and adherence to regulatory expectations regarding capital and liquidity adequacy. An incorrect approach would be to acquiesce to the CEO's request to exclude or significantly downplay the severe liquidity stress scenario. This would be a regulatory failure, because it deviates from the spirit and letter of risk management regulations that require comprehensive stress testing. Ethically, it represents a failure to act with integrity and professional diligence, prioritizing short-term expediency over the firm's and its stakeholders' long-term safety. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct the stress test, but then selectively report only the more favorable outcomes, omitting the results of the severe scenario. This is a clear breach of transparency and honesty, undermining the purpose of risk management, and potentially misleading the board and regulators about the firm's true liquidity position. A further incorrect approach would be to argue that the severe scenario is too unlikely to be relevant. While the probability of extreme events is low, regulatory stress testing often requires consideration of such events to understand tail risk and the effectiveness of contingency plans under extreme conditions. Dismissing a scenario solely on perceived low probability, without a robust, documented rationale that satisfies regulatory expectations, is a failure of professional judgment. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves understanding the firm's risk appetite, the specific requirements of the relevant regulatory framework, and the purpose of risk management tools like stress testing. When faced with pressure to compromise on risk assessments, A professional should clearly articulate the regulatory and ethical implications of such compromises, referencing specific guidelines and principles. They should advocate for a data-driven, objective approach to risk assessment and stress testing, ensuring that all plausible scenarios, including severe ones, are considered and their implications understood. If disagreements persist, escalating the issue through appropriate internal channels, such as the audit committee or board of directors, while maintaining a clear record of the professional's advice and concerns, is a crucial step in upholding professional responsibility. Question 2. The review process indicates that the firm's risk assessment for a new product launch has primarily relied on internal operational data and projections, with limited direct consultation with key client groups and distribution partners. Which approach to risk assessment best aligns with the principles of comprehensive risk management and regulatory expectations for stakeholder consideration? Option A. Delegate the responsibility for risk assessment to the product development team, who have the most intimate knowledge of the product's features. Option B. Conduct a series of workshops and interviews with representative client segments and distribution partners to gather their insights on potential risks, alongside the internal data analysis. Option C. Focus solely on historical performance data of similar products to predict potential risks for the new launch. Option D. Increase the frequency of internal risk committee meetings to review the existing operational data and projections more thoroughly. Correct answer is B. Conduct a series of workshops and interviews with representative client segments and distribution partners to gather their insights on potential risks, alongside the internal data analysis. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for risk mitigation with the long-term implications of stakeholder engagement and the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough risk assessments. The firm's reputation, client trust, and regulatory standing are all at stake. A superficial approach to risk assessment, driven by expediency, can lead to significant compliance failures and reputational damage. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with all relevant stakeholders to understand their perspectives on potential risks and their impact. This aligns with the principles of good governance and risk management, which emphasize a holistic view of risk that considers the diverse interests and concerns of those affected by the firm's operations. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial services in the UK, e.g., FCA Handbook, often mandate that firms consider the impact of their activities on various stakeholders, including clients, employees, and the wider market. A comprehensive risk assessment, informed by stakeholder input, ensures that potential risks are identified, understood, and addressed in a manner that is both effective and compliant with regulatory expectations for treating customers fairly and maintaining market integrity. An incorrect approach that prioritizes only internal operational efficiency without considering external stakeholder impact fails to meet regulatory expectations for a robust risk management framework. This can lead to risks being underestimated or overlooked, potentially resulting in harm to clients or market disruption, which would be a direct contravention of regulatory principles. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data without seeking forward-looking stakeholder insights risks missing emerging threats or evolving risk landscapes. While historical data is valuable, it may not capture the nuances of future challenges or the specific concerns of different stakeholder groups, leading to an incomplete and potentially misleading risk assessment. A further incorrect approach that relies exclusively on senior management's judgment, without broader stakeholder consultation, can suffer from confirmation bias and a lack of diverse perspectives. Senior management may have a vested interest in certain outcomes, or may not be privy to the granular operational or client-level risks that frontline staff or clients themselves are aware of. This can result in a skewed understanding of the risk profile and a failure to identify critical vulnerabilities. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their potential interests in the risk assessment process. This should be followed by structured engagement to gather their perspectives, followed by a systematic analysis that integrates this input with internal data and expert judgment. The final risk assessment should be documented and communicated transparently to relevant parties, demonstrating a commitment to a comprehensive and inclusive risk management process. Question 3. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent pattern of minor operational disruptions over the past 2 years, with no major incidents reported. To proactively identify potential risks that could lead to more significant issues, which of the following techniques would be the most effective and compliant approach for the risk management team to adopt? Option A. Conducting a brainstorming session with all operational staff to generate potential risk scenarios. Option B. Analyzing historical data of past operational disruptions and near misses. Option C. Performing a SWOT analysis to identify internal weaknesses and external threats. Option D. Developing a comprehensive checklist of all known operational risks. The correct answer is B. Analyzing historical data of past operational disruptions and near misses. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a risk manager to select the most appropriate technique for identifying potential risks within a complex operational environment, ensuring compliance with regulatory expectations. The challenge lies in discerning which method offers the most comprehensive and systematic approach to uncovering a broad spectrum of risks, rather than relying on superficial or incomplete analyses. Careful judgment is required to avoid overlooking critical vulnerabilities that could lead to regulatory breaches or operational failures. The correct approach, historical data analysis, is right because it leverages past experiences to proactively identify recurring or potential future risks. This method is grounded in empirical evidence and provides a data-driven foundation for risk identification. Regulatory frameworks, such as those overseen by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, often emphasize the importance of learning from past incidents and implementing robust controls to prevent their recurrence. By analyzing historical data, firms can identify patterns, trends, and specific events that have led to adverse outcomes, thereby enabling the proactive identification of similar risks in the current environment. This aligns with the regulatory principle of maintaining adequate systems and controls to manage risks effectively. Brainstorming, while useful for generating a wide range of ideas, can be subjective and may not systematically uncover all potential risks, especially those that are less obvious or have not been encountered before. It lacks the structured, evidence-based foundation that historical data analysis provides, potentially leading to the omission of critical risks. Checklists, while helpful for ensuring that common risks are considered, can be rigid and may not be adaptable enough to identify novel or context-specific risks that are not predefined. Over-reliance on checklists can lead to a false sense of security if the checklist is not comprehensive or up-to-date, failing to capture emerging threats. SWOT analysis, focusing on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, is a strategic planning tool. While it can identify threats, its primary focus is broader strategic positioning rather than the detailed operational risk identification required for robust risk management. It may not delve into the granular operational risks that historical data analysis can reveal. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes systematic, evidence-based approaches for risk identification. This involves understanding the specific context of the operations, the firm's risk appetite, and regulatory expectations. When faced with multiple identification techniques, the framework should guide the selection of methods that offer the greatest likelihood of uncovering a comprehensive set of risks, with a preference for those that are data-driven and have a proven track record in identifying actual or potential issues. Question 4. Assessment of the potential impact and likelihood of a cybersecurity breach on client data confidentiality. Considering the diverse operational realities and concerns across different business units, requires a methodology that best reflects the principles of risk management exam. Which of the following approaches would be most appropriate? Option A. Applying a standard, industry-wide probability and impact matrix to the cybersecurity breach scenario without further consultation with internal stakeholders. Option B. Relying on the Chief Information Security Officer's (CISO) assessment of the probability and impact, given their technical expertise and oversight of cybersecurity. Option C. Prioritizing the cybersecurity breach risk based on the number of recent minor security incidents reported by the IT department, assuming a higher frequency indicates a greater likelihood of a major breach. Option D. Conducting structured interviews and workshops with representatives from IT, legal, compliance, and key business operations teams to gather their expert opinions on the probability and potential impact of such a breach, and then consolidating this input into a qualitative risk assessment. The correct answer is D. Conducting structured interviews and workshops with representatives from IT, legal, compliance, and key business operations teams to gather their expert opinions on the probability and potential impact of such a breach, and then consolidating this input into a qualitative risk assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the subjective nature of qualitative risk assessment with the need for objective and defensible decision-making, particularly when dealing with diverse stakeholder perspectives. The challenge lies in ensuring that the chosen approach to probability and impact assessment is not unduly influenced by individual biases or the loudest voices, but rather reflects a comprehensive and structured understanding of potential risks. Adherence to the principles of risk management exam's regulatory framework is paramount, demanding a systematic and documented process. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured engagement with key stakeholders to gather their input on the likelihood and potential impact of identified risks. This method is correct because it aligns with the principles of risk management, exam's emphasis on a stakeholder-centric view of risk. By actively soliciting and consolidating diverse perspectives, it promotes a more comprehensive and realistic assessment of both probability and impact. This collaborative process helps to identify risks that might be overlooked by a single individual and ensures that the assessment reflects the operational realities and concerns of those most affected. Regulatory frameworks often mandate or strongly encourage such stakeholder engagement to ensure that risk assessments are robust, inclusive, and lead to appropriate mitigation strategies. This approach fosters transparency and buy-in, which are critical for effective risk management implementation. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies solely on the most senior executive's opinion for probability and impact assessment is incorrect because it risks overlooking critical operational insights and can be heavily influenced by personal biases or a limited understanding of day-to-day risks. This fails to meet the principles of risk management exam's requirement for a broad and objective assessment. An approach that prioritizes risks based on the perceived urgency of immediate operational pressures without a structured assessment of probability and impact is incorrect. This reactive method can lead to misallocation of resources and a failure to address potentially more significant, albeit less immediately apparent, risks. It deviates from the systematic, forward-looking nature of risk management principles. An approach that uses a predefined, generic risk matrix without consulting relevant stakeholders to calibrate the probability and impact scales to the specific context of the organization is incorrect. While a matrix is a useful tool, its effectiveness depends on its relevance and application to the specific business environment. Failing to involve stakeholders in this calibration process can render the assessment inaccurate and less useful for decision-making, violating the spirit of a practical and effective risk management framework. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with clearly defining the scope of the risk assessment and identifying all relevant stakeholders. This should be followed by a structured methodology for gathering input on probability and impact, ensuring that diverse perspectives are captured. The collected data should then be analyzed systematically, using appropriate qualitative tools to arrive at a consensus or a well-justified assessment. Documentation of the process, the inputs received, and the rationale for the final assessment is crucial for accountability and future review. Aligning with the principles of risk management, exam's emphasis on robust governance and auditability. Question 5. Upon reviewing the credit portfolio management function, a firm is exploring ways to optimize its processes for greater efficiency. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for sound credit risk management while enhancing operational efficiency? Option A. Relying exclusively on historical credit performance data for risk assessment without incorporating forward-looking analysis or stress testing. Option B. Implementing a comprehensive review of credit assessment methodologies, ensuring data integrity, rigorous model validation, and the integration of forward-looking economic scenarios and stress testing. Option C. Simplifying credit scoring models by removing certain risk factors to decrease the time required for analysis. Option D. Reducing the frequency and depth of credit assessments for all borrowers to expedite the review process. The correct answer is B. Implementing a comprehensive review of credit assessment methodologies, ensuring data integrity, rigorous model validation, and the integration of forward-looking economic scenarios and stress testing. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficient credit portfolio management with the imperative to adhere to regulatory requirements and ethical principles. The firm is seeking to optimize its processes, which is a legitimate business objective, but the proposed methods must not compromise the integrity of risk assessment or lead to regulatory breaches. Careful judgment is required to identify approaches that enhance efficiency without introducing undue risk or violating compliance standards. The correct approach involves a systematic review and enhancement of existing credit risk assessment methodologies, focusing on data quality, model validation, and the integration of forward-looking economic scenarios. This aligns with regulatory expectations that credit risk management frameworks should be robust, dynamic, and capable of identifying and mitigating potential losses under various economic conditions. Regulatory bodies emphasize the importance of sound internal controls, accurate risk measurement, and the use of appropriate stress testing and scenario analysis to ensure the resilience of the credit portfolio. This approach demonstrates a commitment to proactive risk management and compliance. An incorrect approach that relies solely on reducing the number of credit assessments to speed up the process is professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to a superficial understanding of individual credit risks and the overall portfolio's exposure, potentially overlooking significant vulnerabilities. Such a method would fail to meet regulatory requirements for thorough due diligence and adequate risk assessment, increasing the likelihood of unexpected credit losses and regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach that involves prioritizing the use of historical data without incorporating forward-looking elements or stress testing is also professionally flawed. While historical data is valuable, it may not adequately capture emerging risks or the impact of unprecedented economic events. Regulators expect firms to go beyond historical patterns and consider potential future shocks, making this approach insufficient for effective credit portfolio management and compliance. A third incorrect approach that focuses on simplifying credit scoring models to reduce complexity, without ensuring that the simplified models still accurately reflect creditworthiness and risk, is also problematic. Oversimplification can mask critical risk factors, leading to misclassification of borrowers and an inaccurate assessment of portfolio risk. This would violate the principle of sound risk management and could result in regulatory scrutiny for inadequate risk controls. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct while pursuing process optimization. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements applicable to credit portfolio management, conducting a thorough assessment of current processes, identifying areas for improvement that align with regulatory expectations, and implementing changes through a controlled and validated process. The focus should always be on enhancing the accuracy and effectiveness of risk management, rather than simply reducing effort or cost at the expense of robust controls. Question 6. The efficiency study reveals that a strategic shift towards a portfolio with higher volatility could significantly increase the firm's profitability. However, the firm's risk management team is concerned about the adequacy of their current market risk measurement framework to accurately capture the potential downside of such a shift. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for measuring market risk in this context? Option A. Focusing primarily on the potential revenue uplift from the more volatile assets, assuming that any increased risk will be manageable through diversification. Option B. Implementing a comprehensive market risk measurement framework that includes scenario analysis and stress testing, alongside appropriate statistical measures, to assess potential losses under various adverse market conditions. Option C. Relying on historical correlation analysis between asset classes to estimate potential portfolio losses. Option D. Utilizing a simplified risk model that aggregates the individual risks of assets without considering their interdependencies or potential systemic impacts. The correct answer is C. Relying on historical correlation analysis between asset classes to estimate potential portfolio losses. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a firm to balance the pursuit of profit with its regulatory obligations concerning market risk. The firm's internal efficiency study highlights a potential for increased revenue by taking on more volatile assets, but this decision must be grounded in a robust understanding and management of the associated market risk, as defined and regulated by the relevant authorities. A failure to adhere to these principles can lead to significant financial losses, reputational damage, and regulatory sanctions. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment of market risk that goes beyond simple correlation analysis. It requires understanding the potential impact of adverse market movements on the firm's portfolio, considering various scenarios and stress tests, and ensuring that the measurement methodologies align with regulatory expectations for capital adequacy and risk reporting. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory requirement to accurately measure and manage market risk, ensuring that the firm holds sufficient capital to absorb potential losses and that its risk-taking activities are transparent and well understood by both management and regulators. Adherence to these principles is mandated by regulatory frameworks designed to maintain financial stability. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on historical correlation data to assess market risk. While correlation is a component of risk analysis, it is insufficient on its own. Historical data may not capture unprecedented events or shifts in market behavior, leading to an underestimation of potential losses. This approach fails to meet regulatory standards that often require more sophisticated risk measurement techniques, such as value at risk, VaR, or stress testing, to provide a more complete picture of potential downside risk. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the potential for increased revenue, without adequately quantifying the associated market risk. This demonstrates a disregard for the firm's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Regulators expect firms to proactively identify, measure, and manage risks, not to prioritize potential gains over prudent risk management. This approach risks violating regulations that mandate risk assessment and capital allocation based on measured risk exposures. A further incorrect approach is to use a simplified risk model that does not account for the specific characteristics of the assets being considered or the interconnectedness of different market factors. This can lead to an inaccurate assessment of the portfolio's overall market risk. Regulatory frameworks typically require risk measurement models to be appropriate for the firm's business activities and to be validated regularly. A simplistic model is unlikely to satisfy these requirements and could result in an undercapitalization relative to the actual risks undertaken. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and sound risk management. This framework should include 1. Clearly defining the firm's risk appetite and tolerance levels. 2. Identifying all relevant market risk factors and their potential impact. 3. Selecting and implementing appropriate risk measurement methodologies that are aligned with regulatory expectations and the firm's specific business. 4. Conducting regular stress testing and scenario analysis to understand potential extreme outcomes. 5. Establishing clear reporting lines and escalation procedures for significant risk exposures. 6. Continuously reviewing and updating risk management practices in response to changing market conditions and regulatory guidance. Question 7. Performance analysis shows that the firm's current disaster recovery plan relies on a single, aging backup system that has not been fully tested in over 2 years. Given the increasing frequency of cyber threats and potential for operational disruptions, which of the following approaches best addresses the firm's disaster recovery needs while adhering to regulatory principles of risk management and operational resilience? Option A. Invest in a comprehensive disaster recovery solution that includes redundant off-site data storage, regular automated testing of backup integrity, and a documented, regularly updated business continuity plan that is communicated to all staff. Option B. Continue using the existing backup system but increase the frequency of manual backups, as this is a more cost-effective solution in the short term. Option C. Focus solely on enhancing the security of the current backup system, assuming that data integrity is the primary concern and broader business continuity is a secondary issue. Option D. Postpone significant investment in disaster recovery until a major operational incident occurs, at which point resources can be reallocated to address the immediate crisis. The correct answer is A. Invest in a comprehensive disaster recovery solution that includes redundant off-site data storage, regular automated testing of backup integrity, and a documented, regularly updated business continuity plan that is communicated to all staff. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for operational continuity with the long-term strategic imperative of robust disaster recovery. The firm's reliance on a single, outdated backup system presents a significant risk, and the pressure to cut costs can lead to short-sighted decisions that compromise regulatory compliance and client trust. Careful judgment is required to identify the most effective and compliant disaster recovery strategy. The correct approach involves implementing a multi-layered disaster recovery strategy that includes regular testing of backup systems, off-site data storage, and a documented, regularly reviewed business continuity plan. This aligns with the principles of prudent risk management and regulatory expectations for financial services firms to maintain operational resilience. Specifically, regulatory frameworks often mandate that firms have adequate arrangements in place to safeguard client data and ensure continuity of services in the event of a disruption. This proactive and comprehensive approach demonstrates a commitment to client protection and regulatory adherence. An approach that prioritizes cost savings by relying solely on the existing, outdated backup system is professionally unacceptable. This fails to address the inherent risks of a single point of failure and leaves the firm vulnerable to data loss or extended downtime, which could lead to regulatory breaches related to data integrity and business continuity. Another incorrect approach is to delay the implementation of a new disaster recovery solution due to perceived complexity and resource constraints. This inaction, while seemingly pragmatic in the short term, constitutes a failure to manage foreseeable risks and can result in significant financial and reputational damage if a disaster occurs. It also contravenes the regulatory expectation that firms actively manage their risk profile. Finally, an approach that focuses only on data backup without considering the broader business continuity aspects, such as personnel, communication, and alternative operational sites, is insufficient. Disaster recovery is not just about data, it's about the ability of the entire business to function. This narrow focus ignores the holistic risk management requirements and leaves critical operational dependencies unaddressed. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment, identifying potential threats and their impact. This should be followed by an evaluation of available solutions against regulatory requirements and best practices, considering both cost and effectiveness. Regular review and testing of disaster recovery plans are crucial to ensure their ongoing viability and compliance. Question 8. Implementation of a new client onboarding system resulted in a significant number of client accounts being incorrectly classified due to data entry errors and a lack of adequate system validation checks. This led to misreporting of portfolio performance and incorrect fee calculations, causing financial losses and client dissatisfaction. Which primary risk category does this scenario most accurately represent under the CRM Principles of Risk Management Exam Regulatory Framework? Option A, reputational risk. Option B, operational risk. Option C, market risk. Option D, legal risk. The correct answer is B, operational risk. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a firm to distinguish between different types of risks and their appropriate management strategies within the specific regulatory framework of the CRM Principles of Risk Management exam. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the primary risk category when multiple risk types might be present, and then applying the correct regulatory guidance for mitigation. Careful judgment is required to avoid misclassification, which could lead to ineffective controls and regulatory breaches. The correct approach involves recognizing that the scenario primarily describes a failure in internal processes and systems, leading to incorrect reporting. This aligns with the definition of operational risk, which encompasses losses resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people and systems, or from external events. Regulatory guidance for the CRM Principles of Risk Management exam emphasizes robust internal controls and operational resilience as key components of risk management. Therefore, classifying this as operational risk and implementing controls to prevent recurrence, such as enhancing data validation checks and staff training, is the most appropriate and compliant response. An incorrect approach would be to primarily classify this as market risk. Market risk relates to losses arising from movements in market prices, such as interest rates, exchange rates, or equity prices. The scenario does not describe any external market fluctuations causing the incorrect reporting. Rather, it points to internal system or process deficiencies. Misclassifying this as market risk would lead to the implementation of inappropriate hedging strategies or market monitoring, failing to address the root cause of the problem, and thus violating regulatory expectations for effective operational risk management. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on legal risk. While there might be legal implications arising from incorrect reporting, the primary driver of the loss is the operational failure. Legal risk typically concerns the risk of loss due to non-compliance with laws and regulations, or from contractual failures. While legal risk is a consequence, it is not the fundamental risk category that needs immediate management intervention in this context. Focusing only on legal risk would neglect the necessary operational improvements to prevent future occurrences. A further incorrect approach would be to consider this primarily as reputational risk. Reputational risk is the risk of damage to a firm's brand and public image. While incorrect reporting can certainly damage reputation, reputational risk is often a consequence of other underlying risks, such as operational or legal failures. Addressing reputational risk in isolation without tackling the operational root cause would be a superficial response and would not satisfy the regulatory requirement to manage the primary risk effectively. The professional reasoning process should involve a systematic risk identification and assessment. First, analyze the event to determine the fundamental cause. In this case, the cause is internal process/system failure. Second, map this cause to the relevant risk category as defined by the regulatory framework. Operational risk is the most fitting category. Third, consult the specific regulatory guidance for managing that identified risk. Finally, implement controls and mitigation strategies that directly address the root cause and comply with regulatory expectations for operational resilience and internal control. Question 9. Which approach would be most appropriate for a financial services firm seeking to understand the potential range of financial impacts from a complex operational risk event, considering the interdependencies of various contributing factors and the need to assess the likelihood of different outcomes? Option A, Monte Carlo simulation. Option B, scenario planning. Option C, expected monetary value (EMV). Option D, sensitivity analysis. The correct answer is A, Monte Carlo simulation. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a firm to balance the need for robust risk assessment with the practical limitations of available data and resources, all while adhering to regulatory expectations for sound risk management. The firm must select a quantitative risk assessment technique that provides sufficient insight without becoming overly complex or resource-intensive, ensuring that the chosen method aligns with the firm's overall risk appetite and the nature of the risks being assessed. The correct approach involves using Monte Carlo simulation. This method is appropriate because it allows for the modeling of complex interdependencies between various risk factors and can generate a probability distribution of potential outcomes, providing a more comprehensive understanding of the range and likelihood of financial impacts. This aligns with regulatory expectations for a thorough and sophisticated approach to risk assessment, particularly for significant risks, as it moves beyond simple point estimates to capture uncertainty and variability. It enables better informed decision-making by illustrating potential upside and downside scenarios, thereby supporting the firm's ability to manage its capital and operational resilience effectively. Using expected monetary value (EMV) alone would be an incorrect approach. While EMV provides a single expected outcome, it fails to capture the full spectrum of potential losses or gains and the associated probabilities. This can lead to an underestimation of tail risk and an oversimplification of complex risk profiles, potentially violating regulatory principles that require a nuanced understanding of risk exposure. Employing sensitivity analysis without further quantitative modeling would also be an incorrect approach. Sensitivity analysis is valuable for identifying key risk drivers, but does not inherently quantify the overall impact or the likelihood of different scenarios occurring simultaneously. Relying solely on this method might not provide the comprehensive probabilistic insights required by regulators to assess the firm's ability to withstand adverse events. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the available quantitative risk assessment techniques against the specific context of the risks, the firm's capabilities, and regulatory requirements. This includes understanding the strengths and limitations of each method, considering the data availability and quality, and ultimately selecting the technique that offers the most appropriate balance of analytical rigor and practical applicability to support informed risk management and strategic decision-making. Question 10. The analysis reveals that a UK-regulated bank is reviewing its high-quality liquid assets, HQLA, for its liquidity coverage ratio, LCR, calculation. The Treasury Department has proposed classifying a portion of its corporate bond holdings as Level 2 HQLA, arguing that these bonds are actively traded and have a relatively stable market price. However, the risk management team has raised concerns about the fungibility and potential for price deterioration of these specific corporate bonds during a severe market stress scenario, suggesting a higher haircut than initially proposed by Treasury. Which of the following approaches best reflects the regulatory requirements and professional best practice for determining HQLA eligibility and haircuts under the UK regulatory framework? Option A. Classify the corporate bonds as Level 2 HQLA if they are actively traded and have a stable market price, and apply a haircut that reflects the Treasury Department's assessment of market stability, even if it is lower than the standard prescribed haircut for Level 2 assets. Option B. Classify the corporate bonds as Level 2 HQLA and apply a haircut that is a compromise between the risk management team's conservative estimate and the Treasury Department's more optimistic assessment. Option C. Classify the corporate bonds as Level 1 HQLA due to their active trading and apply a minimal haircut to reflect their perceived liquidity. Option D. Classify the corporate bonds as Level 2 HQLA only if they meet the specific criteria for Level 2 assets as defined by the PRA, and apply the full prescribed haircut for such assets, even if the Treasury Department believes a lower haircut is justified by current market conditions. The correct answer is D. Classify the corporate bonds as Level 2 HQLA only if they meet the specific criteria for Level 2 assets as defined by the PRA, and apply the full prescribed haircut for such assets, even if the Treasury Department believes a lower haircut is justified by current market conditions. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where a financial institution is evaluating its liquidity coverage ratio, LCR, compliance. The professional challenge lies in interpreting the regulatory requirements for high-quality liquid assets, HQLA, and understanding the nuances of their classification, particularly when considering assets that may have fluctuating market values or limited fungibility. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the institution's reported LCR accurately reflects its ability to meet short-term liquidity needs under stress, as mandated by the regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a rigorous and conservative assessment of asset eligibility for HQLA status, adhering strictly to the definitions and haircuts prescribed by the relevant regulatory body. This means ensuring that only assets meeting the criteria for low risk, high liquidity, and stable market value are included, and that any applicable haircuts are applied appropriately to reflect potential value depreciation during a stress event. This approach is justified by the core principle of the LCR, which is to ensure a bank's resilience during periods of stress. Regulatory guidance, such as that provided by the Prudential Regulation Authority, PRA, in the UK, explicitly defines what constitutes HQLA and mandates specific haircuts. Adhering to these definitions and haircuts is not merely a best practice, but a regulatory obligation designed to prevent underestimation of liquidity risk. An incorrect approach would be to adopt a lenient interpretation of HQLA eligibility, perhaps including assets that are not fully fungible or whose market value is subject to significant volatility, without applying appropriate haircuts. This could involve classifying assets as Level 2 HQLA when they do not meet the stringent criteria for such a designation, or failing to apply the full prescribed haircuts to Level 2 assets. The regulatory failure here is a direct contravention of the LCR framework, which is designed to provide a buffer against unforeseen market shocks. Such an approach would lead to an inflated LCR, creating a false sense of security and potentially exposing the institution to significant liquidity shortfalls during a crisis. Another incorrect approach would be to exclude assets that clearly meet the definition of HQLA, perhaps due to administrative convenience or a misunderstanding of their liquidity characteristics. This would result in a lower, potentially unnecessarily conservative, LCR. But the primary regulatory concern with LCR is its underestimation. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory text governing the LCR. This includes detailed knowledge of HQLA definitions, classification levels, and haircut requirements. When in doubt about an asset's eligibility or the appropriate haircut, the professional should err on the side of caution and consult with compliance and risk management departments, and if necessary, seek clarification from the regulator. The ultimate goal is to ensure the reported LCR is a robust and reliable measure of the institution's liquidity resilience, meeting both the letter and the spirit of the regulations. Question 11. The evaluation methodology shows that a risk dashboard is being assessed primarily by the number of risk indicators displayed and the visual complexity of its charts. Which of the following alternative evaluation methodologies would best align with the principles of effective risk management and regulatory expectations for communicating risk to senior management and the board? Option A. Measuring the dashboard's adherence to specific branding guidelines and the overall aesthetic appeal of its design. Option B. Quantifying the total amount of data points presented and the number of different risk categories covered. Option C. Evaluating the dashboard based on the frequency of updates and the technical accuracy of the underlying data sources. Option D. Assessing the dashboard's effectiveness in enabling timely and informed decision-making by senior management and the board, focusing on clarity, actionability, and alignment with the firm's risk appetite. The correct answer is D. Assessing the dashboard's effectiveness in enabling timely and informed decision-making by senior management and the board, focusing on clarity, actionability, and alignment with the firm's risk appetite. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because risk dashboards are critical tools for communicating risk exposure to senior management and the board. The effectiveness of these dashboards directly impacts the quality of decision-making regarding risk appetite, mitigation strategies, and resource allocation. The challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate methodology for evaluating the effectiveness of a risk dashboard, ensuring it aligns with regulatory expectations, and promotes sound risk management practices. Careful judgment is required to move beyond superficial metrics and assess the dashboard's true value in driving informed risk decisions. The correct approach involves evaluating the risk dashboard based on its ability to facilitate timely and informed decision-making by senior management and the board. This means assessing whether the dashboard provides clear, concise, and actionable insights into key risks, their potential impact, and the effectiveness of controls. It should enable stakeholders to understand the firm's risk profile relative to its stated risk appetite. This approach is justified by regulatory principles that emphasize the importance of effective risk governance and oversight, ensuring that risk information flows appropriately to those responsible for strategic direction and control. For instance, under UK regulations and CISI guidelines, a key expectation is that risk management frameworks are embedded within the firm's overall governance structure, and that risk information is presented in a way that supports effective challenge and decision-making by the board and senior management. A dashboard that merely presents data without context or actionable insights fails this fundamental requirement. An incorrect approach would be to evaluate the risk dashboard solely on the volume of data presented or the aesthetic appeal of its design. While comprehensiveness and clarity are important, a dashboard that is overloaded with data, lacks clear prioritization of risks, or is visually confusing can hinder, rather than help, decision-making. This approach fails to meet regulatory expectations because it prioritizes form over function, potentially masking critical risks or creating information overload that prevents senior management from identifying and addressing material issues. Another incorrect approach is to focus exclusively on the technical accuracy of the data without considering its relevance to strategic objectives or the firm's risk appetite. Regulatory frameworks, such as those emphasized by CISI, stress that risk management must be integrated with business strategy. A dashboard that is technically perfect but does not inform strategic decisions or highlight deviations from risk appetite is not fulfilling its purpose. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the dashboard's intended audience and purpose. Professionals should ask, does this dashboard enable the board and senior management to understand our key risks? Does it highlight where we are within our risk appetite? Does it prompt discussion and action? This involves a qualitative assessment of the dashboard's content, presentation, and utility in supporting governance and strategic risk oversight, rather than a purely quantitative or superficial review. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a junior compliance officer inadvertently misclassified a client's investment profile due to a misunderstanding of a recently updated regulatory guideline, leading to a potential breach of client suitability rules. Which of the following is the most appropriate immediate response to mitigate this operational risk? Option A. Issue a formal warning to the junior compliance officer and reiterate the importance of adhering to established procedures. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the internal control framework and staff training materials related to client classification and suitability, and implement targeted retraining for the affected staff and relevant teams. Option C. Immediately escalate the incident to the Chief Compliance Officer and the Board of Directors for their direct intervention. Option D. Document the incident as an isolated human error and consider it a learning experience without further immediate action. Correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the internal control framework and staff training materials related to client classification and suitability, and implement targeted retraining for the affected staff and relevant teams. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in risk management where a seemingly minor operational lapse, human error in this case, has the potential to trigger significant regulatory breaches and reputational damage. The professional challenge lies in identifying the root cause beyond the immediate error and implementing controls that address systemic weaknesses rather than just the symptom. It requires a nuanced understanding of how individual actions can cascade into broader compliance issues. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the internal control framework and the training protocols surrounding the specific process. This aligns with the principles of robust risk management, which mandates not only identifying risks, but also establishing and maintaining effective controls to mitigate them. Specifically, regulatory frameworks for financial services, assuming this exam pertains to such a regulated environment, emphasize the importance of adequate staff training, clear procedures, and ongoing monitoring to prevent operational failures, including human error. The focus on reviewing and enhancing training and procedures directly addresses the root cause of the error and aims to prevent recurrence, thereby demonstrating a commitment to regulatory compliance and operational resilience. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on disciplinary action, without investigating the underlying systemic causes of the human error, fails to address the fundamental risk. This is a regulatory failure, because it neglects the obligation to establish and maintain effective systems and controls. Disciplinary action alone does not prevent future errors stemming from inadequate training or flawed processes. An approach that dismisses the incident as a one-off event without further investigation is also a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to proactively manage operational risks. Regulatory bodies expect firms to have a culture of continuous improvement and to learn from incidents, however minor they may appear. Ignoring such events can lead to a buildup of unaddressed risks. An approach that involves immediate escalation to senior management without an initial internal assessment and proposed mitigation steps is inefficient and can create unnecessary alarm. While escalation is important, a preliminary analysis allows for more informed and targeted discussion, demonstrating a structured and responsible approach to risk management. This can be seen as a failure in efficient operational risk management, potentially leading to misallocation of senior management's attention. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured root cause analysis approach. This involves 1. Incident identification and reporting, clearly documenting the event. 2. Root cause analysis, investigating why the error occurred, considering process, training, system, and human factors. 3. Control assessment, evaluating existing controls and their effectiveness. 4. Mitigation and remediation, developing and implementing appropriate controls which may include enhanced training, process redesign, or system improvements. 5. Monitoring and review, continuously assessing the effectiveness of implemented controls. This systematic process ensures that risks are managed effectively and in line with regulatory expectations. Question 13. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual trading activity in a specific asset class that, while not currently exceeding the predefined quantitative threshold for immediate escalation to the board, exhibits characteristics that could indicate a nascent market manipulation attempt. The risk management team has observed this pattern for the past 3 trading days. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Inform the trading desk to cease all activity in that asset class until the pattern resolves itself. Option B. Document the observation and continue to monitor the situation, as the quantitative threshold for escalation has not yet been breached. Option C. Wait for a client complaint related to this trading activity before initiating any escalation. Option D. Immediately escalate the observed pattern to the Chief Risk Officer and the Head of Compliance, providing a detailed analysis of the potential implications and recommending further investigation. The correct answer is B. Document the observation and continue to monitor the situation, as the quantitative threshold for escalation has not yet been breached. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires immediate and accurate judgment regarding the severity of a detected risk event and the appropriate escalation pathway. The firm's reputation, client trust, and regulatory compliance are all at stake. Failure to escalate promptly or to the correct level can lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client confidence. The core of the challenge lies in distinguishing between routine operational issues and events that pose a material risk requiring senior management or board attention. The correct approach involves a systematic assessment of the detected anomaly against predefined escalation triggers and thresholds. This approach is right because it aligns with the principles of robust risk management frameworks, which mandate clear lines of responsibility and communication for risk events. Specifically, regulatory guidelines, such as those promoted by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, emphasize the importance of timely and effective escalation to ensure that significant risks are identified and managed at the appropriate level within the organization. This ensures that resources are allocated effectively and that senior leadership is aware of and can address potential threats to the firm's stability and client interests. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the anomaly because it falls just below a stated threshold is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that risk events can evolve and that a seemingly minor issue could escalate into a significant problem. It demonstrates a lack of proactive risk management and a disregard for the principle of better safe than sorry. This approach could lead to regulatory breaches if the FCA's principles of treating customers fairly or maintaining market integrity are compromised. Another incorrect approach, which is to escalate every minor deviation to the highest level of management, is also professionally unacceptable. While it errs on the side of caution, it creates noise and can overwhelm senior management, diluting their focus on truly critical issues. This can lead to decision fatigue and a diminished capacity to respond effectively to genuine crises. It also indicates a lack of confidence in the risk management team's ability to handle routine matters, potentially undermining operational efficiency and morale. This approach may not directly violate specific regulations, but is inefficient and counterproductive to effective risk governance. A further incorrect approach, which is to only escalate when a direct client complaint is received, is highly problematic. This reactive stance is fundamentally at odds with proactive risk management. Regulatory expectations, particularly under the Senior Managers and Certification Regime, SMCR, in the UK, place a strong emphasis on firms identifying and mitigating risks before they materialize into client harm or significant financial loss. Waiting for a complaint means the risk has already manifested, potentially causing damage and leading to regulatory scrutiny for failing to prevent it. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's risk appetite statement and its associated escalation policy. This policy should define what constitutes a material risk event, the criteria for escalation, and the specific individuals or committees responsible for receiving such escalations. When an anomaly is detected, the risk manager should 1. Assess the potential impact and likelihood of the anomaly escalating into a material risk, considering both quantitative and qualitative factors. 2. Compare this assessment against the defined escalation triggers. 3. If a trigger is met or there is significant uncertainty, follow the documented escalation procedure, providing clear and concise information about the anomaly, its potential consequences, and recommended actions. And 4. Maintain a record of the assessment and escalation. Question 14. The audit findings indicate a consistent pattern of risk reports being submitted to the board after the agreed-upon deadlines, often lacking the detailed analysis required for effective oversight. Which of the following actions best addresses this situation in line with regulatory expectations for risk management and corporate governance? Option A. Implement a comprehensive review of the risk reporting process to identify and rectify systemic inefficiencies, including data collection, analysis, and dissemination, and establish clear ownership and accountability for each stage. Option B. Issue formal warnings to the risk management team members responsible for report preparation, emphasizing the importance of adhering to deadlines and the consequences of continued noncompliance. Option C. Provide the board with summary-level risk information that can be compiled quickly, even if it means omitting detailed analytical insights and specific risk drivers. Option D. Postpone board meetings until all risk reports are finalized, regardless of how far beyond the scheduled dates this may push the meetings. The correct answer is A. Implement a comprehensive review of the risk reporting process to identify and rectify systemic inefficiencies, including data collection, analysis, and dissemination, and establish clear ownership and accountability for each stage. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a recurring issue with the timeliness and comprehensiveness of risk reporting to the board. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for accurate and timely information with the practical constraints of data collection, analysis, and report generation. The board relies on these reports to make informed strategic decisions and to exercise effective oversight, making deviations from expected standards a significant concern. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the delays and to implement sustainable solutions that meet regulatory expectations and stakeholder needs. The correct approach involves a proactive and systematic review of the entire risk reporting process. This includes identifying bottlenecks in data gathering, analysis, and report compilation, and implementing improvements such as automation where appropriate, clearer data ownership, and standardized reporting templates. The justification for this approach lies in its alignment with the principles of effective risk management and good corporate governance, which mandate that risk information be accurate, timely, and relevant for decision-making. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial services, e.g., FCA Handbook in the UK or relevant SEC/FINRA rules in the US, depending on the exam's specified jurisdiction, often emphasize the importance of robust risk reporting to ensure the safety and soundness of firms and the protection of consumers. A systematic review ensures that the reporting process itself is resilient and capable of meeting these obligations consistently. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on blaming individuals for delays fails to address the systemic issues within the reporting process. This can lead to a demotivated team and does not guarantee future improvements, potentially violating ethical obligations to foster a constructive and fair working environment. Another incorrect approach, which involves providing incomplete or aggregated risk data to meet deadlines, undermines the purpose of risk reporting. This can lead to the board making decisions based on a flawed understanding of the firm's risk profile, which is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements for accurate and comprehensive reporting, and can expose the firm to significant unmanaged risks. Lastly, an approach that delays reporting until all possible data is gathered, even if it significantly exceeds the agreed-upon timelines, also fails to meet the requirement for timely information. This can result in missed opportunities to mitigate emerging risks or to respond effectively to changing market conditions, thereby failing to meet the board's oversight responsibilities and potentially breaching regulatory expectations for prompt risk communication. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured problem-solving approach. First, clearly define the problem and its impact, drawing on audit findings and internal observations. Second, engage relevant stakeholders, including the risk team, data providers, and the board, to understand perspectives and constraints. Third, analyze the root causes of the identified issues, moving beyond superficial explanations to uncover systemic weaknesses. Fourth, develop and evaluate potential solutions, considering their feasibility, effectiveness, and alignment with regulatory and ethical standards. Finally, implement the chosen solution, monitor its effectiveness, and be prepared to make further adjustments as needed. Question 15. Consider a scenario where a financial services firm is required to conduct stress testing to assess its resilience to adverse market conditions. which approach to stress testing best aligns with the principles of proactive risk management and regulatory expectations for identifying potential systemic vulnerabilities. Option A. Applying generic, industry-wide stress testing templates without specific consideration for the firm's unique risk profile, business model, or client concentration. Option B. Conducting stress tests primarily for compliance purposes, with limited integration of the results into the firm's broader risk management framework or strategic decision-making processes. Option C. Developing a range of plausible, severe but not impossible stress scenarios tailored to the firm's specific business activities, market exposures, and client base, and analyzing their potential impact on capital, liquidity, and profitability. Option D. Relying exclusively on historical data to define the parameters and severity of stress scenarios, assuming that past extreme events are the most relevant indicators of future shocks. The correct answer is C. Developing a range of plausible, severe but not impossible stress scenarios tailored to the firm's specific business activities, market exposures, and client base, and analyzing their potential impact on capital, liquidity, and profitability. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a firm to move beyond standard risk assessments and proactively identify potential systemic shocks that could impact its business model and client portfolios. The challenge lies in anticipating unprecedented events and quantifying their potential impact, which inherently involves a degree of uncertainty and requires robust judgment. Careful consideration is needed to ensure that the stress testing framework is comprehensive, relevant to the firm's specific risks, and aligned with regulatory expectations for forward-looking risk management. The correct approach involves developing a range of plausible, severe, but not impossible stress scenarios that are tailored to the firm's specific business activities, market exposures, and client base. This includes considering both idiosyncratic firm-specific shocks and broader macroeconomic or systemic events. The firm should then analyze the potential impact of these scenarios on its capital, liquidity, profitability, and operational resilience. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of robust risk management and regulatory expectations, such as those outlined by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, which emphasizes the need for firms to understand and manage their vulnerabilities to extreme events. Stress testing, when conducted rigorously and with appropriate scenario design, is a key tool for identifying potential weaknesses and informing strategic decision-making to enhance resilience. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on historical data to define stress scenarios. This is professionally unacceptable because past events, by definition, may not capture the full spectrum of future risks, particularly those arising from novel or unprecedented circumstances. Regulatory frameworks often require firms to look beyond historical patterns to consider emerging risks and potential future shocks. Another incorrect approach would be to use generic, off-the-shelf stress tests without tailoring them to the firm's specific risk profile and business model. This fails to address the unique vulnerabilities of the firm and its clients, rendering the stress test results less meaningful and potentially misleading. Regulators expect firms to demonstrate a deep understanding of their own risk landscape and to apply stress testing in a way that is relevant to their operations. A further incorrect approach would be to conduct stress tests in isolation, without integrating the findings into the firm's overall risk management framework and strategic planning processes. This leads to a missed opportunity to translate insights into actionable improvements in capital planning, liquidity management, or operational controls. Professional decision-making in this context requires a systematic process. First, understanding the firm's risk appetite and strategic objectives. Second, identifying key risk drivers and potential vulnerabilities. Third, designing relevant and severe stress scenarios. Fourth, quantifying the impact of these scenarios across various dimensions of the firm's operations. And fifth, using the results to inform risk mitigation strategies, capital allocation, and business planning. Question 16. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent downward trend in the firm's net stable funding ratio, NSFR, over the past 2 quarters. This trend is primarily driven by an increase in short-term wholesale funding and a shift in the asset portfolio towards less liquid, longer-term investments. The chief financial officer is concerned about the potential impact on regulatory capital and market perception, while the head of business development is advocating for continued aggressive lending to maintain market share, arguing that the current NSFR is a temporary consequence of strategic growth. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the Chief Risk Officer? Option A. Prepare a detailed report for senior management outlining the declining NSFR and its potential implications, but defer any significant strategic adjustments until market conditions stabilize. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the firm's funding structure and asset composition to identify specific drivers of the declining NSFR, assess the associated liquidity risks, and develop a strategic plan to restore the ratio to a stable and compliant level, engaging with regulators as necessary. Option C. Focus on increasing short-term lending activities to generate immediate revenue, with the expectation that this will naturally improve the NSFR over time as profits are reinvested. Option D. Advocate for a temporary waiver or modification of the NSFR requirements with the relevant supervisory authority, citing the firm's rapid growth and the need for flexibility in its funding strategy. Correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the firm's funding structure and asset composition to identify specific drivers of the declining NSFR, assess the associated liquidity risks, and develop a strategic plan to restore the ratio to a stable and compliant level, engaging with regulators as necessary. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the net stable funding ratio, NSFR, beyond simple calculation. The challenge lies in interpreting the implications of a declining NSFR in the context of regulatory expectations and the firm's strategic objectives, particularly when faced with conflicting internal pressures. Careful judgment is required to balance short-term profitability with long-term stability and regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive review of the firm's funding profile and asset composition to identify the root causes of the declining NSFR. This includes assessing the stability of funding sources, the maturity profile of assets, and the potential impact of market conditions. The regulatory justification stems from the fundamental purpose of the NSFR, which is to promote resilience in banks' funding profiles over a one-year horizon. A declining NSFR signals increased reliance on less stable short-term funding, potentially exposing the firm to liquidity risks and contravening the spirit and letter of prudential regulations designed to ensure financial stability. This approach demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and sound risk management principles. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on increasing short-term lending to boost immediate returns fails to address the underlying structural issues contributing to the declining NSFR. This is a regulatory failure because it prioritizes short-term gains over long-term funding stability, directly undermining the NSFR objective. It also represents an ethical failure by potentially exposing the firm and its stakeholders to undue liquidity risk. Another incorrect approach, which involves lobbying for a relaxation of NSFR requirements without demonstrating a clear and compelling case for why the current framework is unworkable or unduly burdensome for the firm's specific business model, is also professionally unacceptable. This is a regulatory failure as it attempts to circumvent established prudential standards rather than adhering to them. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of commitment to responsible financial stewardship. A third incorrect approach, which involves simply reporting the declining NSFR without proposing any remedial actions or strategic adjustments, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It signifies a passive acceptance of increased risk and a disregard for the supervisory expectations associated with maintaining adequate liquidity and stable funding. This approach abdicates the responsibility of proactive risk management. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory requirements and their underlying rationale. When faced with a deteriorating NSFR, the process should involve 1. Root cause analysis. Investigate the specific drivers of the decline, considering both funding and asset side factors. 2. Impact assessment. Evaluate the potential consequences of the declining NSFR on the firm's liquidity, profitability, and regulatory standing. 3. Strategic response development. Formulate a plan that addresses the identified causes, aligning with regulatory expectations and the firm's long-term strategy. 4. Stakeholder communication. Engage with relevant internal and external stakeholders, including regulators, to explain the situation and the proposed actions. Question 17. Compliance review shows that following a recent IT system failure, the firm's Business Continuity Plan, BCP, was activated. However, the recovery process prioritized restoring all IT systems simultaneously to minimize downtime, without first validating the integrity of critical data backups or assessing the immediate impact on essential client services. The BCP itself has not been updated since its last review 2 years ago. Which of the following actions best reflects a compliant and professionally sound approach to managing this situation and its aftermath? Option A. Focus solely on restoring all IT systems to their pre-failure state as quickly as possible, then address data integrity and BCP updates once full operational capacity is achieved. Option B. Expedite the recovery process by bypassing certain BCP procedures deemed time-consuming, with the intention of documenting the deviations and updating the BCP retrospectively. Option C. Immediately initiate a phased recovery of critical business functions, prioritizing those with the greatest client impact and data sensitivity, while concurrently validating data backup integrity and scheduling a comprehensive review and update of the BCP. Option D. Communicate to clients that the IT failure was an unforeseen event and that the firm is working to restore services, without detailing the recovery process or the status of the BCP. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a phased recovery of critical business functions, prioritizing those with the greatest client impact and data sensitivity, while concurrently validating data backup integrity and scheduling a comprehensive review and update of the BCP. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate operational needs with long-term regulatory compliance and client trust. The firm is under pressure to resume services quickly, but a rushed approach risks overlooking critical elements of a robust business continuity plan, BCP, potentially leading to future failures and regulatory sanctions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the recovery process is not only swift, but also thorough and compliant. The correct approach involves a structured, phased recovery that prioritizes critical business functions and data integrity, followed by a comprehensive review and update of the BCP. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms maintain resilient operations and have well-documented, tested plans to mitigate disruptions. Specifically, regulatory frameworks often mandate that firms have adequate systems and controls in place to safeguard client assets and data, and to ensure continuity of essential services. A phased recovery, starting with the most critical functions and ensuring data backups are validated, directly addresses these requirements by minimizing the risk of data loss and service interruption to clients. Furthermore, a post-incident review and BCP update are crucial for demonstrating a commitment to continuous improvement and adherence to regulatory principles of sound risk management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on restoring IT systems without verifying data integrity or prioritizing critical business functions fails to meet regulatory obligations. Regulators expect firms to protect client information and ensure the continuity of services that clients rely upon. Simply restoring systems might leave the firm vulnerable to data corruption or the inability to perform essential client-facing activities, thereby breaching regulatory duties. Another incorrect approach that involves bypassing established BCP procedures to expedite recovery, even if seemingly efficient in the short term, demonstrates a disregard for regulatory requirements and internal controls. BCPs are not merely procedural documents. They are essential risk management tools mandated by regulators to ensure operational resilience. Circumventing these plans indicates a failure to adhere to established risk management frameworks and could lead to significant operational and reputational damage, as well as regulatory penalties. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's BCP, its regulatory obligations, and the potential impact of different recovery strategies on clients and the firm's operations. Professionals should prioritize a risk-based approach, focusing on restoring critical functions and data securely, followed by a thorough review and update of the BCP to prevent recurrence. This involves clear communication with stakeholders, including senior management and relevant regulatory bodies, about the recovery process and any deviations from the plan. Question 18. Process analysis reveals that the firm's current risk management training program is perceived by employees as generic and disconnected from their day-to-day responsibilities, leading to low engagement and limited impact on the firm's risk culture. Simultaneously, the firm is under pressure to reduce operational costs. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for cost efficiency with the imperative to strengthen risk culture and governance in line with regulatory expectations? Option A. Outsource all risk management training to external providers without internal adaptation, focusing solely on selecting the cheapest available external training packages. Option B. Significantly reduce the frequency and scope of all risk management training initiatives to achieve immediate cost savings, assuming that employees will maintain their existing risk awareness. Option C. Continue with the existing broad-based risk management training program without modification, as it covers all regulatory requirements, and defer any changes until financial pressures subside. Option D. Realign the risk management training program to focus on the firm's most critical current risks and strategic objectives, ensuring content is practical and relevant to different employee roles, and demonstrating its value through improved risk identification and mitigation. The correct answer is D. Realign the risk management training program to focus on the firm's most critical current risks and strategic objectives, ensuring content is practical and relevant to different employee roles, and demonstrating its value through improved risk identification and mitigation. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for cost reduction with the long-term imperative of fostering a robust risk culture. The firm is facing financial pressure, which often leads to a temptation to cut corners, particularly in areas perceived as less directly revenue-generating, such as risk management training. However, a strong risk culture is foundational to effective governance and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in demonstrating the tangible value of risk management initiatives to senior leadership who are focused on short-term financial performance. The correct approach involves a strategic recalibration of the risk management training program to align it more closely with the firm's current strategic objectives and the specific risks it faces. This means identifying the most critical risks impacting the firm's financial health and operational stability, and then tailoring the training to equip employees at all levels with the knowledge and skills to identify, assess, and mitigate these specific risks. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory expectation for firms to embed a strong risk culture throughout the organization. Regulators, such as those under the UK's Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) framework, emphasize that a firm's culture is a key determinant of its conduct and its ability to manage risks effectively. By linking training to strategic priorities and current risk landscapes, the firm demonstrates a commitment to practical, impactful risk management that supports business objectives, rather than treating it as a mere compliance exercise. This proactive and integrated approach is more likely to gain senior management buy-in and demonstrate the value of risk management investment. An incorrect approach would be to significantly reduce the scope and frequency of all risk management training to achieve immediate cost savings. This is professionally unacceptable because it undermines the firm's ability to manage emerging and existing risks effectively. It signals to employees that risk management is not a priority, thereby eroding the risk culture. From a regulatory perspective, this could be seen as a failure to adequately discharge the firm's responsibilities under principles such as the FCA's Principle 3, Conduct of Business, and Principle 7, Communications with Clients, which implicitly require firms to have systems and controls in place to manage risks, including those arising from a weak risk culture. Another incorrect approach would be to continue with the existing broad-based training program without any modifications, despite the identified lack of engagement and perceived relevance. This is professionally flawed because it represents a failure to adapt and improve risk management practices in response to feedback and changing business needs. It is a missed opportunity to enhance the effectiveness of the training and, consequently, the firm's risk culture. Regulators expect firms to continuously review and improve their risk management frameworks, including training programs, to ensure they remain fit for purpose. A third incorrect approach would be to outsource all risk management training to external providers without internal oversight or integration into the firm's specific risk appetite and strategic goals. While external expertise can be valuable, a complete abdication of internal responsibility for designing and overseeing training can lead to a disconnect between the training content and the firm's unique risk profile and culture. This could result in generic training that does not adequately address the specific risks faced by the firm, potentially leading to compliance gaps and a weakened risk culture, which would be a concern for regulators. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the current risk culture, including identifying areas of weakness and employee feedback. This should be followed by a strategic review of the firm's risk appetite and key strategic objectives. The risk management training program should then be redesigned to directly support these elements, ensuring that it is relevant, engaging, and demonstrably contributes to the firm's overall risk management effectiveness and compliance with regulatory expectations. This involves a continuous feedback loop and a commitment to adapting training strategies to the evolving business and regulatory environment. Question 19. The performance metrics show a consistent decline in customer retention rates over the last 2 quarters. As a risk manager, which of the following approaches to identifying the underlying risks would be most appropriate and compliant with the principles of effective risk management? Option A. Immediately propose implementing a new customer loyalty program, assuming the decline is due to a lack of incentives. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of customer feedback, operational processes, and market competitor analysis to identify all potential contributing factors to the retention decline. Option C. Rely on the sales team's immediate assessment that the decline is solely due to increased competitor pricing. Option D. Focus on a single, easily quantifiable metric, such as website bounce rate, as the primary indicator of the retention problem. The correct answer is A. Immediately propose implementing a new customer loyalty program, assuming the decline is due to a lack of incentives. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a risk manager to balance the immediate need for action with the imperative of thorough risk identification, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework of the CRM principles of risk management exam. The pressure to demonstrate proactive risk management can lead to premature conclusions, potentially overlooking critical underlying issues. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the identified risks are accurate, comprehensive, and actionable, rather than superficial or misdirected. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based process of risk identification that prioritizes understanding the root causes of the observed performance deviations. This approach is right because it aligns with the fundamental principles of effective risk management, which mandate a comprehensive assessment before implementing controls or solutions. Regulatory frameworks for risk management, such as those implied by the CRM principles of risk management exam, emphasize the importance of a robust risk identification process as the foundation for all subsequent risk management activities. This ensures that resources are allocated to address the most significant and relevant risks, preventing wasted effort and potential regulatory noncompliance stemming from a failure to adequately identify and assess risks. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most visible symptoms without investigating underlying causes is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence in risk identification, which is a core regulatory requirement. And not delving deeper, the risk manager risks misdiagnosing the problem, leading to ineffective mitigation strategies and potentially exposing the firm to further, unaddressed risks. This can be seen as a breach of professional duty and a failure to comply with the spirit and letter of risk management regulations that demand a thorough understanding of the risk landscape. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a few individuals without a structured data collection and analysis process is also professionally flawed. This method lacks the objectivity and rigor required by regulatory standards for risk identification. It can lead to biased or incomplete risk assessments, failing to capture the full spectrum of potential risks or their true impact. Such an approach undermines the credibility of the risk management function and can result in regulatory scrutiny for inadequate risk assessment procedures. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to risk identification. This includes 1. Clearly defining the problem or observed deviation. 2. Gathering relevant data from multiple sources. 3. Employing analytical techniques to identify potential root causes. 4. Categorizing and prioritizing identified risks based on their potential impact and likelihood. And 5. Documenting the entire process for auditability and future reference. This systematic methodology ensures that risk identification is thorough, objective, and compliant with regulatory expectations. Question 20. Quality control measures reveal that a risk management team is evaluating methods to assess the firm's liquidity risk. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of robust liquidity risk measurement as expected within a regulated financial services environment? Option A. Monitoring the absolute balance of cash held in the firm's current accounts on a daily basis. Option B. Reviewing the firm's reported net profit for the most recent fiscal quarter. Option C. Relying solely on the firm's current external credit rating as the primary indicator of liquidity strength. Option D. Assessing the firm's ability to meet its short-term obligations by quantifying potential cash flow mismatches and evaluating the adequacy of unencumbered, high-quality liquid assets to cover these mismatches, particularly under stress scenarios. The correct answer is D. Assessing the firm's ability to meet its short-term obligations by quantifying potential cash flow mismatches and evaluating the adequacy of unencumbered, high-quality liquid assets to cover these mismatches, particularly under stress scenarios. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a risk manager to distinguish between a superficial understanding of liquidity risk and a robust, regulatory-compliant approach to its measurement and management. The challenge lies in identifying the most appropriate method for assessing liquidity risk within the specific regulatory framework of the CRM Principles of Risk Management exam, which emphasizes adherence to established principles and guidelines rather than purely theoretical or overly simplistic measures. The risk manager must demonstrate an understanding of how regulatory expectations translate into practical measurement techniques. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves selecting a measurement method that aligns with the principles of effective liquidity risk management, as typically outlined in regulatory guidance for financial institutions. This typically means focusing on metrics that assess the institution's ability to meet its obligations as they fall due, under both normal and stress conditions. A key aspect of this is considering the availability of unencumbered, high-quality liquid assets and the potential outflows of cash. Regulatory frameworks often mandate stress testing and scenario analysis to understand potential liquidity shortfalls. Therefore, an approach that quantifies potential cash flow mismatches and assesses the adequacy of liquid assets to cover these mismatches, particularly under adverse conditions, is considered best professional practice. This aligns with the overarching regulatory objective of ensuring the financial stability and solvency of institutions. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that solely focuses on the absolute level of cash on hand without considering its availability or the potential for outflows is incorrect. This fails to capture the dynamic nature of liquidity risk and ignores the critical aspect of meeting future obligations. It is a superficial measure that does not reflect regulatory expectations for comprehensive liquidity risk assessment. Another incorrect approach would be to measure liquidity risk solely based on the institution's overall profitability. While profitability can indirectly influence liquidity, it is not a direct or sufficient measure of liquidity risk. Profitability does not guarantee the ability to meet short-term obligations, especially during periods of market stress or unexpected withdrawals. This approach neglects the core principle of liquidity risk management, which is about the availability of cash to meet immediate needs. Finally, an approach that relies only on the institution's credit rating is also insufficient. While a strong credit rating can be indicative of financial health, it does not directly measure the institution's ability to withstand liquidity shocks. Liquidity crises can occur even for highly rated entities if their liquid assets are insufficient to cover unexpected outflows. This method overlooks the specific mechanisms and metrics required by regulators to assess an institution's resilience to liquidity pressures. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and the practical application of risk management principles. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory requirements and guidelines applicable to the institution and the exam's jurisdiction. 2. Identifying key liquidity risk indicators that are mandated or recommended by regulators. 3. Evaluating different measurement approaches against these requirements, focusing on their ability to capture both normal and stressed liquidity positions. 4. Selecting a method that provides a clear and actionable assessment of the institution's ability to meet its obligations, considering asset encumbrance, funding sources, and potential cash outflows. 5. regularly reviewing and updating measurement methodologies to ensure they remain relevant and compliant with evolving regulatory expectations.